Hey people, my name's Akala, author of Natives. I am here at my local Waterstones. This is my book Natives here. It's out on the 17th of May. And this is a book really, it's part memoir, part political essay. And what it does is it takes significant episodes from my life and then essentially tries to use scholarship and history to explain why I see the world the way I do. So it takes things that I went through and extrapolates them and looks at if these were isolated experiences or if they have larger relevance to the forces of race and class, as we see there from the subtitle, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. It looks at my own experiences in the larger socioeconomic and political and historical context of British society. So I want to share with you some of my favourite books, books that have most influenced me, across the spectrum: fiction, politics, history. This one right here is, in my opinion, of the sci-fi that I've read, the best science fiction book ever written. Yes, I am going to say that, and yes, you can hold me to account on that. Dune by Frank Herbert. It is indescribably good. I would say, ideas-wise, if we think of someone like Philip K. Dick, for example, incredible ideas, but with the greatest of respect to Mr. Dick, the writing is not necessarily as poetic. Whereas with someone like Frank Herbert, you get both. You get that kind of literary pleasure of beautiful language, kind of ornate language, but not overdone, and incredible ideas. It's set on the planet Arrakis, which is a desert planet, around what they call this geriatric spice melange, which is a none too subtle metaphor for oil. There's a lot of Middle Eastern history in there, very, very clearly, but made into allegory. It's set around this family called the Atreides, which is one of the royal houses on the planet Dune, which is the other name for the planet Arrakis, and it's just an incredible saga of struggles for power, of competition between aristocratic houses, of how a charismatic leader can unite and otherwise, poor and disparate and warring people. The characters are alive in my head. The world is alive in my head. It is genuinely one of the most influential, brilliant, beautiful, realistic stories of fiction I've ever come across. Dune by Frank Herbert. So this book right here is one of the most influential political books of the 20th century. And again, I say that not lightly. This is the Wretched of the Earth by Franz Fanon. Fanon was a Martinican psychologist who participated in the Algerian War for Independence. He was over there treating people during that war, but he was one of the greatest, or arguably the greatest, anti-colonial scholar of the 20th century, part of this really important and globe-shifting post-World War II upheaval that saw many of Europe's former colonies win their independence in really, really gruesome battles for independence and battles for freedom. And one of the greatest critiques of imperialism really looks at the psychology of colonized people, and the colonizer really breaks down a lot of the most unpleasant dynamics of human history. It's honestly one of the most influential reads, written in incredible prose, really, really eloquent, even as he's saying some of the most brutal, difficult things, very much influenced by socialist thought and Marxist thought and things of that nature, but put its own, what is now called, Black Marxism, has this very much third world, global South, Pan-Africanist spin on Marxist thought that was, for a lot of us, people like me who come from the Caribbean, grew up in the intellectual tradition, very much influenced by Franz Fanon. So it's really hard to overstate how much this book influenced my worldview, many other people's worldview, and many other people's understanding of the destructive nature of colonialism, and pushed people towards, I don't want to say revolutionary because that's a very easy and big word to throw around, but a more revolutionary politics or a more critical politics that's critical of power. So it's really a book that everybody should read to really, really understand the impact that colonialism had on the global South from a psychological perspective, from someone who lived it and saw it firsthand and breathed it and dedicated his life to it and died an early death partly because of it. Mr. Franz Fanon, The Wretched of the Earth. So the next book I want to look at is by a man who I do believe won the Nobel Prize for Literature, but don't quote me on that. A man called Jos Saramago, and this is his greatest book. I've read a couple of his books, but from what I've read, I'm going to say this is his greatest book, a book called Blindness. I don't know whether to call it dystopian. A man is at a traffic light and he goes blind, and this contagion of blindness starts to spread throughout the city, and then the authorities quarantine all the blind people in a mental asylum where they get terrorized by crazy blind people. And not that I'm saying blind people in general are crazy, I'm saying what happens in the book. And then the asylum burns down and they escape, and the blind contagion affects the city, which the entire city and the entire society. And I believe it's obviously a metaphor for the human condition, for our own blindness, for our hatreds, for our fears, for our passions, for our wars, for all of those things. But it's just unbelievably well written. For a start, the guy refuses to use punctuation. For all the young people at school, you learn rules so you can break them. And what Saramago shows is if you know the rules of punctuation as well as he presumably does, you can basically do whatever you want. There'll be like 3 pages without a full stop, and it makes sense. I don't know by what alchemy is this achieved. He has no speech marks. There's hardly any full stops. He'll use a comma and then put a capital letter after the comma. Look, I'm not lying. Root, comma, all with a capital A. So this is genuinely, it's interesting because even though my book is a politics book and it's non-fiction, I never used to read fiction till about, 7 or 8 years ago actually. And it's writers like Saramago that are one of the largest reasons why I realized that something was missing from my life, and that fiction is actually sometimes realer than real life. And this book, when you really finish it, you feel, a certain sadness about the human condition, but generally just admiration for a writer that is just unbelievably good. So this one here is Blindness by Jos Saramago. So this book right here is, shockingly, I feel a bit embarrassed to admit this, but I'm going to admit this anyway. This is actually the only Toni Morrison book that I've read. I know I'm not supposed to say that in public, but it's the truth. I have a couple of others, and why I haven't read any more Toni Morrison since I read this maybe 5-6 years ago, I have no idea. Again, another Nobel Prize winner, fully deserved her prize, one of the greatest literary figures of the 20th century. I'm going to have to read some more Toni Morrison. This one here, Song of Solomon, is set in the 1930s. It's between a black wealthy landowner, son of a black wealthy landowner, a man called Macon Dead Jr. And his sagas with his friend Guitar, who, as he's traveling through the South. And it brings up some areas of black American life in that period that most people don't know about. For example, most people just presume, who are not familiar with the period, that African Americans were generally poor in the period in the 1930s before integration, but there are actually lots of wealthy black people in that period, and so she sets it between this son of a wealthy black landowner, but then his friend Guitar, who joins an African American terrorist organization, essentially, or at least an organization set up to rival and revenge the atrocities and the lynchings being perpetrated in that time by people like the Ku Klux Klan and other groups, and so it really is a kind of a political analysis, really, of black life in that period and the different paths and sagas. But really, like all Morrison's books, no matter how much there's a background of politics and society and history and the challenges faced by black America, they're always great, believable, honest, complex human characters. So another great book, another Nobel Prize winner, another one of the greatest writers of all time, Toni Morrison, Song of Solomon. Read it.